Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm excited to have you all, some of you see some repeat visitors from our previous webinars and a lot of new folks, so that's great. We're excited to talk to you a little bit about the new release of our new renderer version 5.0. It's our hope that as a tool that you're using or considering to use with that's embedded within applications that you're building, the Form.IO serves as an extension of your development function. And in that, we want to keep things going and move forward and have things be modern and be a good experience while you're using the libraries. So we're going to go through some of those updates. My name is Heather Hornor. I am the COO here at Form.IO. I'm joined by Travis Tidwell, CTO of Form.IO and co-founder and inventor of the platform. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Travis, to dive into everything and show us what's new with Formio.js 5.0.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I really appreciate that introduction. As she mentioned, my name is Travis Tidwell. And while, yes, I did, I guess you technically invent the Form.IO platform, I just want to make sure that I mention that we at Form.IO have an amazing team that has spent an enormous amount of effort to take this platform to where it is today. So I can barely claim any of what I'm about to show today because of the amazing team that we have here at Form.IO that has been done some amazing contributions. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen because what I'd like to do is I'd like to take everyone through. Of course, I'd like to talk a lot about the upgrade of Formio.js from 4x to 5x. That's going to be one of the major. Hopefully you can see my screen, Heather.
Yep, I can see the slides. And I just want to mention also any questions that come up. Please feel free to put them in the Q&A and I will answer them in line or we'll answer them at the end as they come in.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I would like to, obviously I'm going to cover the upgrade and all of the changes, breaking changes, some of the major very exciting improvements that we've made to this platform. But what I'd also like to maybe start off with is just talk about the renderer itself. I recognize that there might be some new people maybe on the call that are looking to see if Form.IO is the right solution to you. For you. And I feel like this might be a great opportunity to kind of talk about the renderer, what that technology is, how it's used, and that'll also set the stage for talking about some of these major improvements that we've made to the platform. So first of all, let's talk about what is the JavaScript renderer. We use that word a lot, but what do we mean by that? The first thing I'd like to mention is that the renderer is a JavaScript library, and it incorporates really two major components of the Form.IO platform. Something that we like to call the form builder, which I'm going to show here in a minute. And the form builder is responsible for providing developers and non-developers alike a very simple drag and drop interface that allows you to create forms. What that builder really does under the hood, though, is it builds JSON. And JSON is this standard that we have incorporated at Form.IO that allows you to create very complex data structures. And JSON is the format that we use, and our builder is responsible for creating that JSON. What that then does is it creates JSON represented as forms. And I'll show you some examples here in a minute. And then the renderer's responsibility is to convert that JSON form into HTML, which is what is rendered in your browser. The other thing that the JavaScript renderer is responsible for is creating a separate JSON object that we call the submission. Something fairly unique about Form.IO, if you compare Form.IO to other form systems on the market, is that we keep these two objects completely separate from one another. The form JSON and the submission JSON are completely isolated from one another. And that allows a lot of benefits to take forms and saturate it with other data, keep it separate for reporting. So reporting is another major feature that Form.IO offers to manage your data, report on your data, but also allows for a lot of other major features that we have, such as rendering PDFs with data and all of the like. So we try very hard to keep this very distinct separation between form and submission data. The other thing that the renderer does is it validates and processes submission data. And I'm going to talk further a little bit about this because it's the processing of the data that's really changed within 5X. And then, of course, whenever you're ready to submit that form, so you fill out the form, you click the submit button, that data has to go somewhere. So the renderer is responsible for sending off the API call to your own deployment if you've deployed Form.IO and in Form.IO Enterprise in your own environment. But we also have the ability to submit that data to any API that you wish. So you can absolutely render a form and then submit that data to your own endpoints. We do have a demonstration of this concept on a page. If anybody wants to go to this URL, this really demonstrates this concept very well. So if you view here, this actually shows the embedded form builder. Keep in mind, this is just a demo application that we've built to kind of show off some of the rendering and building libraries. But right here is the embedded form builder. And you can see how this works. So if I drag and drop, first name, maybe make that required, add some validation, that effectively creates this JSON object over here on the right-hand side. And so the same thing goes for last name, validation, required. And so this JSON is then handed to a renderer, which renders it in your application. And when somebody fills out that form, that produces this submission JSON, which is now going to be submitted via API to the Form.IO platform. So this is a really good visualization of all of these concepts kind of coming together. Now, something about this process has changed significantly in 5X, and that is around the data processing of the Form.IO renderer. Before I get into that, though, it actually is a little bit important for me to talk about the isomorphic nature of the renderer. Commonly, we use this word called isomorphic. And what that effectively means is that it's one single source, ISO, that can be utilized or used in two different environments, the morphic. So it's morphing, it's like an ISO library that can be used in two different runtimes. So when you embed this form into an application, the first environment that this JavaScript library is being used is inside of the client application on the device itself. So the device actually renders the form and performs a lot of these data processing on the data that you're submitting. But it's very important to also know that when you submit that form, that data travels over an API, travels over the wire, and hits our enterprise platform, the Docker container in your environment. And here it actually executes that same JavaScript library again to validate the submission, to do data processing. And so we're effectively using one library to kind of accomplish two separate goals. And this is one of the benefits that you get out of Form.IO is you get this congruence between application logic and server-side services data processing. Form.IO is one of the few, if not only, platforms on the market that provides this direct congruence between the embedding of the application data forms and also performing that exact same logic on the services themselves via an isomorphic library. And we use JavaScript as our means of doing this. So now in order to understand what is the flow of the renderer has three major functions. The first thing that it does is it takes JSON, that JSON object, and it converts it into a string represented as HTML. That's called the render phase. Once it's been rendered, the renderer then hands over the process to a separate phase called the attach phase. And this is responsible for rendering that HTML. Once that HTML is rendered on your page, we then go through every single component and we attach event listeners to those DOM elements. So that if you're typing, events are triggered and the renderer knows that the user is typing on that. And once those event listeners have triggered, it then hands it over to a separate entity or a separate thing, which is the data processing portion of the renderer flow. And this processing, the data processing function is responsible for three major things. One is validation, the other is calculations, and the other is conditionals. And then, of course, if anything changes on the form, like for example, if you're typing or you checked a checkbox and that makes, because of conditionals, that makes other fields hide or show, the process will say, okay, well, now these components have changed. We have to cycle back through this once again where the form refreshes, you see the fields hide or show, and now we start the cycle all over again. It's important to know this because in order to understand the major change that happened in 5X, this is one thing that changed dramatically. And so what we did in 4X is we effectively loaded the entire JavaScript renderer, not only in the client, which makes perfect sense, because the client library should render a form, it should listen for human input, and it should process the data. But on the server, it's a little less efficient, embedding the entire renderer, but that is what 4X did. So 4X embedded the full renderer, which had all of this logic for rendering and attaching. Now, of course, we skipped over a lot of that logic, but that logic was there. And then it finally, what really mattered in the server was this data processing phase, which is responsible for ensuring that the APIs also perform calculations, validation, conditional logic. It was in this moment that we recognized a major opportunity of improving how this works. And through many planning phases with the team, myself, and also my team, we recognized that we could improve the server performance dramatically, as well as memory footprint, as well as even improve security by breaking out this data processing as like its separate entity so that it can be used independent of the renderer so that we can actually use that in the server. And this was the instigating thing in 5X. So what we did in 5X is we created this new data processing engine, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And this data processing engine is now able to be used as an independent data processor on the server, while at the same time being embedded in the renderer on the client. It's still isomorphic, as you see here, but now we're just basically taking a chunk of what used to be completely a part of the renderer, and now that is part of the actual server side data processing. So we did this by introducing a brand new library that we like to call core. The core library, which you can see here at GitHub on GitHub, if you go to Formio core, in fact, I can just show that to you right here. This is the library that we have effectively adopted. Now, this library has kind of gone through some evolutions. We had some original ideas that this might become our new renderer. There are some remnants of that still in this library. But a while ago, we decided that this core library, what it really should represent is the core mechanics, the core utilities, and core functions that are these isomorphic logic that both the renderer and the server should be able to utilize. It is vanilla JavaScript. This is not in a framework. It's not React. It's not Angular. This is vanilla JS written in TypeScript. And so all of this is basically typed via TypeScript, which I'm going to talk about like our usage of TypeScript later, because that's another major part of the benefits of this work that we've been doing. The other important thing is this is also MIT licensed. We stay strong with our commitment to open source, to enable all of our customers to have that visibility and that transparency, that they can trust that this technology is absolutely the most robust and secure library that you're going to be able to find for forms and data processing. And a big part of that is to maintain um, our resolute stance on open source contributions. The other thing that I just mentioned, but I'm also just going to say it again, is that this core library provides that isomorphic JavaScript core logic between the both renderer and the server. So this includes three major things currently. We do have some plans on introducing some additional features, but one is the utilities. The second is the SDK, which these have previously been in the renderer. But like the utilities, for example, is like each component. Some of you may be using that function, but the others is like the SDK. This is very popular for people to use. So like if you want to interface with our APIs, it's very common that you might use our SDK to like load forms, load submissions, save submissions, and the like. And then finally, the third part is this form processors. Now, before I dive deep into that, I actually kind of would like to take a pause. Heather, if you have any comments on what we said previously, or if anybody has any questions, now would be a good time to answer those quickly, and then I'll dive into the form processors next.
Yeah, I think we're good. I've got some questions in the Q&A that I'm answering in line so far, and I think we're marching down the road.
All right, I will keep on going. I'll try to take pauses generally as through this. So if anybody has any questions that I need to answer in context, I'm very happy to do that. So let's talk about this new concept called processors. In order to understand what a processor is, you think of this as independent functions that perform operations on data. And the other important aspect of processors is that these are functions that are executed on every data value of every form component. It's really important to understand this concept because that is the most fundamental feature of this data processor. And so what I mean by that, let's imagine you have a form. So you have this web form. We typically call that the root. And this web form has some fields on it. So like first name, last name, email. But then you might have some nesting components, like data grid is a really good one. So data grid creates like this nesting of these components. So for example, let's say your form has a section called children. And inside the children, you have first name, last name, birthday. But then also, as part of this form, let's say that you need to fill out another form. So you might even have a nested form within this form. Another amazing feature of Form.IO is we provide you this ability to nest forms inside of one another. But what you effectively get from that is a nested form that itself has its own fields, such as plan, which might be a select dropdown, or contributions, which might be currency on what you want to contribute to the plan. And effectively, that is the form JSON. So this right here would be the form JSON. But what you also might have is the data associated with it. And the data might look like this, where you have one-to-one connection between these flat level fields, so like first name, last name, email. But it gets complicated once you get to the data grid, because look what happens here. The data grid has a one-to-one connection to these fields, but there's multiple instances of the data because it's in an array. So it's an array of data. Same goes with the nested form, is that this is also nested inside of its own nested structure. And guess what? The benefits form could even have another data grid or another edit grid. You could put a nested form inside of the data grid. Like that is one of the amazing things about Form.IO is we really allow you to create all of these very complex configurations of your forms that then translate to very complex data structures that you can create with the submission data. So what the data processors do is it iterates over every, if you think about it, iterating through every single line of this JSON. So it iterates through this value of the first name component, Smith, Joe at example, hits the data grid. From there, it goes into the first index of that array, John Smith, birthday, which is the first name, last name, and then it goes on to the next index of the data grid, Sally Smith, 8/25/14. So this is one of the major functions of the data processors. Now we introduced, and I'm going to talk about this function in a minute, we introduced a new utility that allows for this complex iteration of the data in addition to the form JSON. We call that function each component data. I'll talk about that later because that I actually have a slide for that. But that is this function that we use to create this iteration through this submission JSON. And we effectively execute the following functions on every single iteration within that each component data. There's several functions that we have. One is for validation, the other is for conditionals, calculations, clear on hide, default value, logic, fetch. There are others. For those of you software people out there or developers, if you would like to see the code behind this, again, this is another amazing thing about having MIT licensed software. Go to core, click on source, click on process. Each one of these folders is a separate processor. So for example, if you want to see how validation works, you can click on the validation processor and then click on the index where you will see that we are actually bringing in. So here's the rules, but the actual function that gets executed is this validate process function. And what's great about the way we did this, of course, everything is typed. So you know the types of how that function, these signatures of what it should look like. It creates it receives a context. And from there, it can go through all the validation rules for that component to evaluate it. So this is wonderful because now all of this data processing logic is isolated into this core library and actually can also be used independent from the renderer. And I'll talk about that in another slide.
There was one question in here about calculations, just because we're on this screen that I wanted to cover. The question was, how does the move of calculations on the server side affect offline mode? I had said I don't believe that the runtime calculations within the forms would be affected in this way, but I was wondering if you could speak to that, what that means to be on the server or not, and how that affects someone that's having that has offline mode in their application.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So calculations, we actually have several configurations within the calculations that enables you to do certain calculations only in the client, as well as maybe even the server if you wish. So one of the configurations, if you're building a form here and you go over to the calculations, so it's under the data, one of the features that we have is if you check this box called calculate value on server, this will actually trigger the processors on the server to perform those calculations. This is actually very important because sometimes you may not want to perform calculations on the server. Sometimes you may want for the server to based on what it receives via API, those become the values. Whereas other times you might want to force the calculations to occur on the server. Like for example, if you don't want somebody to be able to, for example, via POST API, manipulate data that should be calculated, you can check this and then it'll force that calculation to also occur on the server as well. The reason why I bring that up is because we have a configuration that explicitly separates client side from server side, and offline mode would be the client side operation of the calculations, which get executed just like a regular form would that's embedded. The only difference is if you're in offline mode, there's when you click submit, instead of that post request going to the server via API, it's stored within your index DB of your data of your browser so that that can be processed later. Ultimately, offline mode will eventually make its way to an API. Effectively, what you're doing there is deferring the API traffic to when you are back online is how the offline mode works. So hopefully that answered that particular question. Good question. Any others?
Looks like that's all for now.
Good. All right. So let's talk about the first major change to 5X. And actually, I would like to say that this was the instigating change of 5X, was this new processing system that really the idea for it was to benefit the server. In fact, whenever we really dug our teeth into this, we were really in that moment thinking, how can we really improve, make some big strides on the server for security and performance? And this new concept is really what we came up with. And I'm very excited about it because it's made some major improvements in performance as well as security by introducing this data processor. So now we actually kind of had a little bit of a problem. Now we had this separate library responsible for all this amazing things, and the renderer was not taking advantage of it. So then we said, well, we need to bring that in to the renderer, this concept, this processing concept into the renderer. And that's a great opportunity to increment the version to 5X because this is a major change. It was in that moment that we said, okay, we're already making a 5X version. We should take this as an opportunity to also make some other major swings, big improvements. Because we're already going to have to increment this to 5X, what other things can we do to help and improve the product? And so because of that, we actually introduced three main goals for the 5X release. The first one we've already talked about, separate data processing from rendering. But there's also two additional other goals that we brought into this release that we're very excited about. The second one is to improve the developer experience. We recognize at Form.IO that the customers, the people who use Form.IO and embrace it are developers. Now, there's a lot of other types of people who benefit from Form.IO. There's business process owners, non-developers that absolutely benefit from the deliverables of Form.IO, such as our drag and drop form builder, which doesn't require a developer to use. It has this low code, no code concepts to it. But ultimately, it's the developers who take Form.IO and embrace it and embed it within their own applications. So it's been very important for us as an organization to improve that overall experience. I'm going to talk about that next. The other third one is to improve the performance of our renderer. And there's several things that we were doing that were not like bad, but they were just would be considered inefficient, especially on the server side data processing. There's also another, I would actually include maybe a forward slash here and say security, because the other very important thing that 5X helps out with is security, especially on the server side. And I can briefly talk about that in a minute. Because we have this new evaluation of processors, we were able to embrace this new technology for Node called isomorphic VM, which just completely elevates our security footprint, like making it really robust from a security perspective. So there was, three major areas, goals but we also have that security as well. So let's talk about some of the developer experience improvements that we've made to the renderer. The first one is we've modernized the namespace of the renderer. Historically, if you wanted to install for our renderer, you would use Formio.js, one word. And we've now moved to a more NPM organization compatible namespacing format, which is now using the @ symbol Formio/JS. You'll recognize this as being a very common pattern for a lot of different libraries these days. Form.IO, we're getting really close to having our 10-year anniversary here at Form.IO. And 10 years ago, a lot has changed in the developer and JavaScript communities. And this is one of those things where it's recently changed and it's become like this thing where developers have this namespacing, and now we are in the moment where we're going to embrace that as well. So Formio.js. Now, immediately a lot of people are like, okay, well, if that changes, how does that affect my application? I don't want to have major refactorings in my application. I'm happy to report that one of our goals with 5X is, while yes, we're going to change the namespace, we're going to make some major improvements, we do not want to cause much disruption in terms of having to refactor how you're using our renderer. So in almost all cases, now there's a few exceptions, but in almost all cases, all you have to do is change Formio.js to @Formio.js when you're importing it into your application. All of the function calls, all of the interfaces, all of the objects that are exported have stayed the same. So you will not notice any difference other than now you're going to be importing from a new namespace, which is great from a developer experience perspective. The other thing we did is we took the opportunity. 4X was using the Bootstrap 4 version that has been, it's still around, but there's now a new version, Bootstrap 5. We used that as an opportunity to say, let's bring in Bootstrap 5, let's make it the default. There was also a new icon library that Bootstrap 5 introduced. Historically, we were using Font Awesome with a 4X, and that now it's kind of the standard for Bootstrap applications that we have this thing called Bootstrap icons that is now being brought in as the default icon set as well. The good news is if you have applications that are still on Bootstrap 4 or even Font Awesome for that matter, we have made it possible for you to still bring in the 5X renderer, but then use the Bootstrap 4 template. So you can still upgrade your renderer in applications without having to upgrade Bootstrap, because that was another thing we wanted to ensure of is like, hey, we don't want this to be a problem for people to upgrade if they do not wish to upgrade Bootstrap to Bootstrap 5. So there is a way to get Bootstrap 4 and have those templates still render within the application, and this is how you do it. So the other thing that I'm very excited about is historically, if you wanted to use the utilities or if you wanted to use the SDK, you would have to bring that in from the renderer. And the renderer is a fairly large library. It has all of the templates, it has all the component logic. It's pretty big. And if you just want to use the SDK or use the utilities, you don't want to bring all of that into your application. This core library can now be imported as its own library in your application. And you can use the utils, like for example, if you want to say each component, you can just bring in those utils there. If you want to bring in the SDK to load a form. So like this is a very common thing to do actually, is to load a form, which does that, and then iterate through all the components, which that's what this code does. And you can just do that via importing directly from core, which is a great new benefit of using this very minified core library. I think the last time I did a build, this was just like right at 100K maybe a little bit bigger. So it's a reasonably sized library. The other thing that you get out of the DevX is the JS doc implementation. So actually, I've got this pulled up in one of my demos here. Um, so this is actually mounted from the docs folder inside of our core library, so you can see this yourself. But every single function is available. So like if you click on like delete or delete action, great. We got examples show how to do it. This is how, these are how the functions work. Here's what the parameters are. So now with the introduction of TypeScript, which I'll talk about in a minute, we also have been creating a lot of JS docs within our source code so that we can create this auto documentation that creates via JS doc, which is a great technology for creating documentation. So you now get that as well within core. We now have this new function, which I alluded to at the beginning, but I want to make sure I talk about it here, which is this each component data function. It's very handy, especially if you have the form JSON and you have the submission JSON, and you want to iterate through every component, but not just every component. You want to iterate through every value of every component. Each component data is going to be your friend. This has a lot of unit tests written around it. This is also the fundamental function that we use for the data processing system. So it's all based on this each component data, where uses that function for the data processor. It's a very handy function to look at and to utilize. The other thing that we've actually been introducing is TypeScript. We've spent a lot of time to build out types and bring those into this core library. So I'm going to show something that, you're a developer if you're going to get excited about what I'm about to show you. This really excites me. You can see a lot of the types that we've been working on. Now, there's still some more that we have to work on, but one thing that we've been doing is if you click on, for example, this component type, we have been TypeScript documenting all of the JSON properties for every single component. And this is exciting. We're using TypeScript to extend from certain components. And okay, the address component is like the container component, but it also brings in these other field or these other properties. The table component does this. The number component does this. This really excites me because now we are really using code as our mechanism to document the JSON structure of what these components should look like. So if you're a developer using Form.IO and you are writing software that references the date time component, your IDE is going to pick up if you use date picker show weeks Boolean. And it's going to really give you all of those types so that you can experience that within your own IDE. And of course, this is what it looks like. So if you're importing, you say new Formio, your IDE just immediately picks up on those types and it shows the documentation right in your IDE. I also know that AI, the new AI tools, the one from GitHub, Copilot, they also reference these type definitions to help out and to learn. So I'm really excited about also the implications that this has on, some of the AI tools out there as well. Really exciting stuff. The
One
other
quick
thing, yeah, go ahead.
is about, we had some stuff about JSON structure. I think it is probably a good time to cover this right now.
Yeah, sure.
There's some questions about regarding the JSON structure and if it's changed at all. Is the JSON structure of the resulting form any different than previous versions?
It is the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've always maintained a reverse compatible stance when it comes to the JSON. Now, what we do sometimes is we'll add a new property. because that's still technically reverse compatible. So if we want to add a new feature as an example, the JSON only changes by adding fields, which is okay. What we don't do is we do not modify the meaning of an existing property, or modify entire or change if it was required. We now change it to like a structure in required. We don't do that. So we always have maintained the JSON. So if you have a form that is built in 4x, it will render and function exactly as it did in 4x in 5x, unless there's a bug.
Yeah,
But
and I think
generally,
one of
that's
the
the.
yeah, and if there's anything that anyone's seeing, obviously please write in and we'll respond to it. But
Mhm.
the goal of this upgrade too is to be very painless and to try to the new namespace is intended to be something for ease, right? And so there's a lot of changes here, but we did our best and put a lot of effort into making this reverse compatible, easy to upgrade to, more or less unnoticeable, right? We've had, I think, between product and the development functions internally, we're like, yeah, but what do you see? And the developers are like, nothing. Um, that it's not supposed to be noticeable and it's supposed to improve the experience. And so we're not making these, changes to be structural changes. It's more upgrades to what's going on. And in that too, there was another question about creating and implementing custom controls or custom components. And that would,
Oh, that's a good question as well.
yeah. And so if you
Yeah,
want,
I want to just make a quick comment on what you just said, just because it is funny how we have a whole QA team here at Form.IO. They're an amazing team. You know, they do an amazing job of testing our product. And when we were rolling this out, they exactly said that, like, what are we testing? What is this 5x thing? What are we testing? And we actually said to the RQA team, if we did this right, you will not notice anything. Like nothing will change. And that is actually absolutely the end user experience is nothing is different. Whereas under the hood, the developers will notice, the developers will experience these changes and these improvements. But ultimately, the front end, the end user experience, should be the same. So let's talk about custom components. That's a great uh, comment. We have also maintained identical component interfaces. And what that means is if you have written a custom component in 4x, that component should function exactly as it does in 5x, unless there's a bug. Now, there are a couple of things to be aware of. We have some breaking changes, and this might be a good moment to talk about those breaking changes. A lot of the breaking changes are these internal methods, these internal data structures that you might be using in a custom component. Like the biggest one for me is the change we made to the errors array. I can see how you might have a component written in 4x that uses this structure for the error. Historically, if you had multiple errors, it would be structured as error, messages, and then the array. And this has been changed in 5x to be more semantically correct, which now its errors is an array. And to get the first error message, it's error zero message. It's more semantically correct, but it's just something to be aware of. So if you have any custom components in 4x, I don't want to make the blanket statement that every 4x component will be able to be upgraded without changing anything. I don't think that would be responsible for me to say that. But what I will say is that we did our best to ensure that it's as seamless as possible. Now, there's a lot of functions, like for example, like check validity, Whereas that was a function in 4x. And what we did, instead of just deleting that function, because keep in mind, one of the major things we changed was the validation system is now different in 5x. We still have this function. It's just a wrapper around the new function, which is process validations. I think it's called process. Yeah, I'll have to dig that up. But the point that I'm trying to make though is that the name of this function is still there. So if you have a custom component that overrides check validity, you might also need to call what the 5x renderer calls now, which is this other method that performs the validation. So those are things that you just need to be aware of whenever you're upgrading your components. But otherwise, all of the component structure, if you have code in your application where you're used to saying like formio.components.components.text field dot to reference the rendered form, that's all the same. It has not changed. Good questions. Anything else, Heather?
Nope, let's keep going. We've got about 15 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm almost towards the end here. So the other thing is the build sizes. We've had a major reduction in build sizes. A lot of this had to do with our embracing of TypeScript. That helped a lot by reducing the build sizes. Um, I think we used to almost be close to 2 megabytes in 4x. It was like 1.8, 1.9. We're now to like 1.2 megabytes, which is a big reduction of about 30%, 50% or 50% reduction in some of these sizes. The other thing is we now have really isolated and separated out this difference between the builder and the renderer. So one thing that we recognize with 4x is a lot of times we'd get on it with the customer, we'd see that they were importing, for example, Formio.js to just simply create a form. I mean, they did that because that's how we did it. That's how it was documented. But one thing that to take note of is that that was also bringing in the builder code. And so if you just want to render a form and you don't want to embed the form builder, it's more efficient to just now import from Formio.js /form, which will only include the form renderer elements. So you can now call Formio create form, and your build sizes will be reduced because of this. So you'll notice your application bundle size will be smaller because we're not including all of this builder code. The same goes if you use the embed scripts. So like if you do a script and you're embedding, I see this a lot where if you're embedding formio.full.min.js, full includes the builder and the renderer. So if you're just going to render a form, use form instead. It's smaller and it's more efficient to embed that. Any questions over developer experience before we go into performance improvements? Performance improvements should be pretty quick.
Yeah, it looks like we're ready to go. No questions right now.
All right, so let's talk about what we did with performance improvements. So we've already talked about this by moving these processors to core, and now the server is just using the processors. Well, what we've noticed and recognized because of that is a major reduction of server-side performance, load, and memory usage. So if you are using 9x and above of our API deployment, you will see these benefits. Now, every deployment is different. That's why we can't give actual numbers here. But we personally, so we have our hosted deployment, we've seen upwards of 40 to even 50% reduction of memory usage from our deployment. But again, everyone's going to be different just because of the types of environments that you're spinning up and using. But just know that 9x, because of these core improvements and these data processing improvements, you will see performance and memory improvements, as well as allow for more concurrency. So more people can hit the server at the same time, which is going to help a lot of people out. The other thing that we've implemented is this concept called lazy loading for the renderer. Historically, if you were to build an application, let's imagine you have an application that has a lot of features in the application, but maybe 1 or 2 pages of that application have a form in it. Historically, if you wanted to include Form.IO in your application, you would be taking the penalty of the entire renderer size to maybe just have 1 or 2 pages embed a form. And we decided to help those people out by creating this new concept of lazy loading. So what we've done is we've got this script, which is Formio.js embed, and this is a tiny script. I think it's 14K. It's very small. And all it does is it renders a loader. So where you have that form embedded in your application, it plops a loader. And then what it does is it dynamically, via REST APIs, fetches, actually not REST APIs. What it does, it injects the script tags in your DOM to bring in the full assets or the form assets. But it does that while the loader is already loading. So if any of you have applications out there where you notice that before you can even view a form, you just see a white page, the reason why that happens is because if you've bundled our renderer in your application, the browser has to download the entirety of that JavaScript before it renders the page. Well, now with this concept, the page will render immediately. They'll see a loader where that form is supposed to go, which is a much better user experience. And now the renderer will send off and get the renderer, add it to the DOM, and then it effectively passes along all of your arguments to the true create form function once it's been loaded, which then will load the form into the application. Now, a lot of people ask, does this make the form load faster? I want to make sure I'm very clear. It does not. The
Yeah, that's
form will,
one of the questions was, is the client side performance improved? And my answer to that is like the perceived performance is improved, right? But it's about perception, and it's
it's
like,
about user experience.
yeah,
Exactly right.
and that has improved, or it's the perception of performance has improved because you're not loading everything all at once. It's bringing in things as needed in this new modality. And so it feels a lot faster, even though from start to finish for everything you need doesn't change. It just doesn't do it all up front.
Exactly. I will say that this system is great. It's not for everyone. It works really well if you have an application that where only a few routes you're loading a form. If your application, if the entirety of your application is forms, I personally wouldn't use this because honestly, it actually ultimately has to load a little bit more JavaScript to function because it's got to load this embed script first and then it loads the full script. It's not that noticeable. But if your full application is a form application, you probably can just stick with what you have been doing with the full loader. The other thing I'll mention is if you are bundling your application and putting it on the device itself, which is typical if you're doing like the capacitor applications is really popular, like those where you're taking a web app and you're basically bundling it to be ran on the application. Don't do this. It doesn't make sense in that case because the script is already on the device and that would load immediately already. It doesn't make sense. This really applies if you're building an application that is loading these assets from the web. And then in that case, it really will improve user experience because the app will load immediately, they'll see a loader, and then the form will then render in its place. So a few more things, and then we'll be done. So get component has also been improved. The performance has been improved. We also recognize that there are a lot of form scripts. We've seen this happen quite a bit where you want to maybe from another component set the value of another component. I personally don't agree with that method, but everyone has their reasons why they would do such a thing. So I see a lot of root get component first name set value Joe. This now is very fast. Whereas in 4x, this would do a search through the entire form to find that component. This is now getting the reference from a map. So it's going to be very fast. And that is it. So yeah, we hope that you enjoy 5x. I think we have about 5 minutes for questions, Heather. Is there any remaining questions? I know we've been kind of tackling them as the presentation's been going, but
Yep. So one that I wanted you to speak to was about some styling. So our customers, almost 100% of them have their own custom styling that they put in their, to match their application. That is, they're not just using Bootstrap, they have their own styles. The question is, does any of the HTML structure change? Because this would impact how styling is applied.
if you use the Bootstrap 5 template, yes, because Bootstrap 5 does indeed change some of the DOM structure. But if you were upgrading your app from 4x to 5x, you would have to deal with that anyway. If you use the 4x template, as I showed in my previous example, it does not, no change between 4x and 5x.
Perfect. And then there was a question about when we were going to be updating this SaaS portal.form.io to have 5x. We're actually going to be upgrading it to 9.4 when that comes out. So we have a couple features that are coming out with 9.4.0 that are on our plate right now. That's including e-signature as well as enterprise form builder module that will not be released to portal.form.io, but there will be informational pages about those features just to be able to see what they are so people are aware of them. That we're going to be upgrading when that comes out. So that's on our agenda.
I would also like to mention that we're doing this kind of in a stepwise approach. Our first 9.4 will be the 5x renderer using the Bootstrap 4 template. And then we'll have a separate release later on. We haven't decided this yet of when that'll be to upgrade the portal to 5x. But I don't want people to think that we're immediately upgrading to 5x on the portal quite yet. We're kind of the 5x render with 4x Bootstrap, and then later down the road we're going to bring in that Bootstrap 5.
All right. I think that's all. I want to say thank you to everybody for attending today. We had a really great attendance, and I'm very happy that everyone could join us. Please don't hesitate to reach out as you're upgrading to 5x. We are here for you. Don't bang your head against the wall. We love to hear from you and how it's going. If there is anything that comes up, we also love positive feedback. So if you just want to reach out and tell us how great it is, we love that too. But we're here for you. And you can reach out to us at support@form.io. And we hope you enjoy the upgrade. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.